Good morning and welcome to the 19th webinar in the Governing for Reform series. Today's topic is making bold decisions for a successful future. My name is Ben Wallace. I'm a partner at KPMG. I run our national policy, economics and public impact business, and I'm our global leader for human and social services. Before moving on, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. So Mani Ngā Budni, or welcome from Kaurna land. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm coming to you from and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge the cultural authority of the Indigenous leaders of lands from around the country you may be coming to us from today as well. It won't be any surprise to people on this call that the aged care sector has been going through a period of significant and sustained reform. With the backdrop of the recent Royal Commission, ongoing changes to funding models, challenges with workforce attraction and retention, and a backdrop within all of that of some challenges with viability in some segments of the market. Bold decision making is critical in charting a path through this period of uncertainty, but equally can be difficult because of those complexities and because of the heightened focus on risk. Today we're joined by a fabulous panel. I'm very pleased to have with us Professor Peter Shergold, Raelene Thompson and Darren Bierbeck, and I'll introduce them further in a moment. Before doing those introductions and getting into the Q&A, I just wanted to do a bit of an advertorial. So hopefully many of you will be joining us and have joined us before, but we may have some people who are joining us for the first time. If that's the case, welcome to the Governing Reform Program. As a participant and having registered for this webinar, you've got access to a whole range of resources. I'd encourage you to head to the Governing for Reform website where you can access previous webinars. You can also access relevant tools to today's session, such as the Strategic Planning Toolkit and podcasts on similar and related topics. Just like to draw your attention to the layout of the screen. You might not be familiar with the format we're using today. You can drag and drop and shift and change the shape of the various screens in front of you in order to suit your personal preferences. Also just wanting to call out that we're really keen for this to be an interactive session. The best sessions are the ones where we get lots of Q&A from the audience. So you will notice there is a question and answer function. And if you would like to get into the Q&A box, I'd encourage you to do that, and we'll attempt to work some of those questions into our discussion shortly. So in that context of challenge and change, we have with us today three fabulous guest speakers, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. We have Professor Peter Shergold. Peter Shergold is Chair of the Board of a range of public, private and not-for-profit organisations. He was previously Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and chaired the Aged Care Reform Implementation Council between 2012 and 2014, and also the Aged Care Sector Committee from 2014 to 15. Since 2015, Peter has been Chair of Opal Healthcare, which operates nearly 100 communities across a range of states in South Australia. I also have with me Raelene Thompson. Raelene's been Chair of the Board of Uniting Aged Well since 2017 and recently been reappointed for a further 3-year term. Uniting Aged Well provides residential and community services to older Australians across Victoria and Tasmania. Raelene's previously managed the Commonwealth Aged Care Standards and Accreditation Agency for Victoria and Tasmania, and was previously the State Manager for the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing in Victoria. Raelene's also been the Acting Chief Executive Officer and COO for Wesley Mission as it transitioned into the Uniting brand, and was previously a board member. And I also have with me Darren Bierbeck. Darren's the CEO of Resthaven Incorporated, which is a large not-for-profit South Australian organisation which is associated with the Uniting Church. Darren's worked across a range of sectors previously, including manufacturing and local government, and has had a 20-year association with the aged care industry through executive and board roles. Darren joined the board of Resthaven in 2016 before moving into an executive position in 2019 and being appointed as its CEO in 2020. Darren has an MBA, is a fellow of the CPA Australia, and has a strong focus on corporate governance. So welcome to all of you. It's my great pleasure to have you all with me today, and it's a great topic I think we have in front of us. I think for me, the sector is undergoing a really significant period of change. People on the line will probably say, well, that's nothing new. It's been going through significant change for a long period of time, which I think is also accurate. I think in the context of the focus on consumer outcomes and quality, the changes in funding model and arrangements, as well as broader challenges with sort of workforce and viability, it is a particularly challenging time for governing bodies and executives to navigate. And so in that context, I think that the conversation today really is about how to navigate the balance of that sort of strategic long-term thinking about where your organisation is going, as well as dealing with some of the shorter-term tactical challenges that you face. And so I'd love to open up with a question, and Raylene, perhaps you can jump in on this one first, about the importance of having a framework through which you make those decisions. And I'm interested in whether you might have an example of a kind of bold or challenging decision that your organisation has made or faced, and what is the decision-making framework you've applied, and why is that important?
Thanks, Ben. And before I start, could I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm joining you from, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So just briefly, I think the framework that we use, which is fundamental at Uniting Agewell, is our strategic plan and our risk framework. So they go together hand in hand, but really any decisions you're making that are about the future should be informed by your purpose and vision and who you are as an organisation and the context in which you operate. So we find that a very grounding piece of work that we've done to ground our decisions, our risk appetite, and also our understanding of what opportunities might be out there. And so the quick example I would give is we recently had an opportunity to enter into a partnership to create an intergenerational childcare, aged care facility in partnership with a group that had a passion for this concept of intergenerational childcare. And it was right in the middle of the pandemic. So one would say, well, we should have run screaming from the space. But as a board, we were presented with a business case that was informed by our strategic plan. It identified the risk and the opportunity. And the board, with some nervousness, I have to say, decided that this was absolutely in line with our belief that we should innovate and we should take risk and we should listen to what the community wants in this space in aged care. And so we decided to go ahead. Now, the implementation of that was informed by the context of the current circumstances around the pandemic. But nonetheless, it's been up and running for a year now, and it's just fabulous. And we think it's probably a first of its kind in Australia under the one roof with a true intergenerational program. It's got a research component to it, so we will be reporting on it into the future, which also meets our strategic plan around being innovative and evidence-based. And so that's one of the examples I would use. I would say, just to add to that, in that space we had tactical, bold decisions to make around the pandemic, but they were short term, and if you only make those, then I think you do miss your opportunities.
Thanks, Raylene. That's a great reflection, and I think being able to rely on your sort of vision and purpose as an organisation, and then having a strategic plan that is sort of high level enough but gives enough guidance to help make those decisions is really important. Darren, I might come to you. I think you've shared with me previously some examples of some big decisions you've needed to make and how you've navigated your way through those in the context of change. Have you got an example maybe of one of those decisions, and how did you rely on a decision-making framework to guide you through that?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people. I'm also on their land. So a couple of years ago, we acquired a large retirement village, and it was located in Adelaide's eastern suburbs. And it was actually a pretty significant acquisition for us. We hadn't made a large acquisition of that type for many years, and it was in a sector of the market we had limited exposure. So much so that when we did acquire it, the village actually has its own branding, so it's quite separate from what Resthaven had done in the past. But in terms of what it was for Resthaven, it was an increase of basically doubled our retirement living portfolio at that time. But what we did was we assessed that against our strategic objective of growing retirement living and diversifying our income streams, because like many aged care providers, we're heavily dependent upon government income. And this was all at the time when we're getting very low returns from our investment portfolio, and we're looking at ways to increase that. So the discussions that we had at a board level were, is that the sector of the market we'd like to be in? And the discussion that we had was that, we don't discriminate in any way. We look after all older people, regardless of where they sit in the socio-economic continuum, and then went through the process of actually acquiring that ultimately. But it was a process that happened over a fairly long period of time. So we started the discussions and went through your normal due diligence type process. But again, a bit like Raylene, it was interrupted by COVID. So the decision was actually put on the back burner for a period of time. And so there's a couple of bold decisions there. One, to go into an area that was not familiar to us, but also to make the decision to walk away at a point in time and not go ahead. And in terms of our frameworks, just adding to what Raylene was saying, we have a process throughout the course of the year where we look at a 10-year cash flow, which most organisations would do. We have a paper called the Growth and Size, which assesses how big we want to become, where we want to grow into. We also have a communities of interest paper, which talks about the types of communities of interest, the types of people, the geographic areas we might be looking at. So, for example, we have a strong area in the Riverland, the Murraylands, and also the Southeast. So that's actually enshrined in a document that we update pretty much every year. That combined with things like competitor analysis, geographic modelling, and also anything that we look at, we use assessment tools to assess that. So whether that be retirement living, residential care, or community services, to assess whether we're making the right decision as we go. So it's a matter of having all those things in place to actually assist with that decision making.
Thanks, Darren. And so again, a sort of a real combination of alignment to purpose as well as discipline in terms of the analysis applied to those decisions as well. But Peter, you've had a whole range of very senior leadership roles across a range of different sectors, and so I happily invite you into this conversation as well in your role as chair at Opal, but perhaps also drawing on other significant decisions you've had to make across your career and how you apply a sort of framework to those decisions.
Very happy. First of all, I think I would say with Raylene and Darren, ditto. I mean, I really agree with everything that they've said. And I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora. That land stretches from South Circular Head down through Circular Quay, down to Blackwattle Bay. And I'm glad to join you today. There is a difference between being bold in the design of public policy, I think, and being bold in the implementation of that policy. I've always thought that was the case. You needed to bring policy design and policy delivery together. Obviously, at Opal, I'm very much involved in implementation within the policy constructs given us by government. I'd have to say, honestly, going to the theme of this webinar today, when you look what's happening in our sector, we know the financial challenges that are being faced. We see, care communities shutting down. In my view, a board, an executive management have to be bold in order to actually survive. And I think you've got to be bolder still to sponsor. But it has to be constrained boldness. It does need to be exercised within a carefully considered strategic framework, one which we return to annually, if not sooner, to think, have we got this right? And that boldness needs to be flexible because things can change quite quickly. I happen to be chair of an organisation, as you said, that is expanded significantly over the last 8 years. But if I just think back over the last 2 or 3, there are a number of ways you can expand. You can expand through greenfield site development, building a new community, very attractive. Or you can decide to invest in updating an existing facility, making sure that, you've got single rooms for care. Or you can, of course, seek to take over someone who wants to care communities from an organisation that wants to exit. Now, the economics of that has changed. I can tell you over time. A couple of years ago, the best way to do it in most, if not all instances, was probably by building ourselves. Right now, the best, but not in all instances, is probably looking at takeovers. As you say, we were in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, WA, and we just moved into South Australia through taking over the communities previously run by the Churches of Christ. So you do need to go about this carefully. You need to make careful assessments, do your due diligence, work out where it fits within your strategy, and then having done that, work out what are the returns on investment if you're successful. Now, I don't ever work on just one figure. What I want to know is what is the minimum and what is the maximum assessed returns on investment from, for example, purchasing a new property. But here's the thing. People often think the boldness is making that decision and then break out the champagne when they've, acquired 2 or 3 new communities. That's when the boldness actually starts, because that's when you need to be bold enough to make the changes, to make sure that you fully integrate that new home or those new homes into the objectives that you've got for your organisational, not just the financial objectives, but very much, the social and cultural objectives.
Thanks, Peter. Really great observations. I do remember being around in the public sector at the time. You were there in Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the drive toward trying to better integrate policy and implementation. And I think there's an interesting sort of thread here in the conversation about the connection between strategy and execution, and a thread about, I think, the pace with which strategy needs to be reviewed, refreshed, and updated. It's a constant process. It's not a we set a 5-year strategy and we review it in 5 years or 3 years or 1 year. It's a constantly evolving environment. And I think in that context, the nature of the relationship between governing boards and executives are shifting as well, and the way in which you engage also with your broader stakeholder landscape is important in that. And so perhaps another theme that would be good to pick into is a little bit about that process of engagement and consensus building. And for me, on observation, and I'm not a deep aged care sector expert, but an observation around the sector is that we've got a lot of people who are in and of the sector and have been part of it for a very long time and are there driven by values and passion to make a difference. And we've got an increasing number of people from different backgrounds who bring a range of skill sets that are absolutely necessary to taking the sector forward. In that context, and as you're facing into challenge, there are inevitably going to be different perspectives, and there's going to be, some challenge with getting consensus, and perhaps you never get consensus. But I'm interested just in that formulation of strategy and reaching a bold decision about how you do engage across the board, across the executive, with your consumers and community to bring them along on that journey. So I wonder, maybe Darren, on that one, I might come to you first, and then we can build from there.
Sure. One of the most important things, obviously, is getting that voice of the consumer and customers that we serve first and foremost. And I guess with all of this, it's having the discussions along the way, rather than coming to one point where you're actually making a bold decision at that time. But if you're informing people as you go, we had an interesting one where we've had an investment portfolio for many years, and we've been very conservative in the way that we've applied that, largely to term deposits and the like. But there was a view on the board that it was time to be a little bit more contemporary, look at a more balanced portfolio, and perhaps take on a little bit more risk, particularly at a time when we were getting such low returns on interest rates. And for us as an organisation, that was a process we actually needed to go through slowly. We needed to make sure we had the information for the board members to make the decision or make that change, because it had been very successful. We'd actually, in many ways, outperformed over a reasonable amount of time through some difficult periods through the market. So for us, it was about seeking the advice of experts and bringing them in and bringing them in front of the board, in front of the executive to inform those groups. It was about speaking to other providers. In fact, I think I reached out to Uniting Agewell to see what they were doing and really get the benefit of the experience of many people and bring that to the fore. And then not rushing the decision. Because it was a relatively large change for us, take the time to actually implement it properly, and so that everybody was on board. One of the things we also did was looked at our board skills matrix and identified that we actually needed somebody with that investment advice. We are a conservative organisation. We hold over 85% of our RAD balances in investments across the board. So that's over $200 million in our case. So it's a very important aspect of a very important part of our portfolio. So we needed to do it right. So we brought on that person onto the board to give us that skills and experience as well.
Thanks, Darren. And so a really important role of the board is to make sure there's an appropriate kind of contest and challenge of ideas and the right kind of respectful but independent relationship with the executive. Peter, on this one, I wonder whether you've got an example or something you'd want to draw on about where something you've done, perhaps at Opal, has been contested, and how you sort of navigate through that contest of ideas to get to a point where you can make a decision and then people can fall in behind it and drive to implementation, as you talked about before.
Yeah, it's a good question. But what you don't want, of course, on a board, what you don't want as a CEO is to surround yourself by yes people. That is really dangerous. You don't want a board that's broken into factions. So you want a real diversity of background and experience where everybody can contribute, but do understand they're operating with the C and the executive management as part of a team. It's difficult to get that right. For Opal, of course, it's a bit challenging because I have board members who own the business. They are the security holders. But we all realised, and in fact, of course, it's government policy now, that you need independent board directors as well. So I was very comfortable. We had a huge amount of commercial experience, understanding of corporate responsibility. But what I thought I could bring, of course, is quite a deep understanding of how government works, how it makes decisions, how policy is set, how regulatory authority is wielded, and so on. And I went and recruited someone who was onto the board with a really deep experience of clinical governance. So that way, try to make sure I had the right group of people who would be willing to have robust discussions between themselves and with the executives, but would at the end of the day, work on the basis of consensus. I have never been at a board member where it, required us going to a vote, for example. And of course, you can see that in all sorts of ways. But let me just give you one, which is an interesting one, I think, because it goes to the personal ethics and views that someone brings to the board, the whole person. They're just not an expert. They've got backgrounds, experience, perspectives. But the issue of voluntary assisted dying. Now, this is a pretty sensitive issue obviously in care communities. And I was aware that if I talked to the people in our organisation, just like if I talked to the board members, there would be different views on whether or not, they were supported or were comfortable with voluntary assisted dying. So what I had to do was make sure we brought all those real world perspectives, but to think about how do we deal with this in terms of the best interests of our residents. And of course, residents would have different views, their families would have different views. So our essential decision when we gained consensus was to understand that we had used the rhetoric and were committed to the rhetoric that when you came to one of our care communities, it was your home. In some ways, it might be the most important home in your life because here was where you're going to be spending your final years. Now, if we told people it was their home, then we came to the conclusion it must therefore be within the legislation that exists, which isn't, of course, in all states, but within the legislation exists, their decision whether they wanted to access voluntary assisted dying, whatever our personal views were. And then, of course, having taken that, you needed the boldness and the insight to make sure that you were able to monitor this very carefully, that you properly trained your people in what they could and could not do, if they were uncomfortable, how they could withdraw from this process. A whole lot of things follows from that decision. But the key was getting that key piece of consensus first. Whatever we think, this is people's homes, it must be up to them to make the decision and then work through all the implications of that.
Thanks, Peter. Great example. Raylene, is there something you'd like to kind of build on there? And then I do have an question I'll come to next.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that example, Peter. I would just add to it's a great example of the nuances in life, isn't it, that we've got to be aware of. But in Victoria, you'll all know that voluntary assisted dying has been in for a few years now, and as a organisation that's owned by the Uniting Church, we had a engagement process within the Uniting Church with all its agencies sponsored by the Uniting Church to grapple with this difficult issue where some church-based organisations were being told that they would not be allowed to let people make that decision, and I personally was quite concerned about that, one from a human rights perspective, a respect perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, because we all know under the aged care legislation people have a right to make decisions in their home, and they also have security of tenure. So I was quite concerned about that and how that might play out in reality. So just reflecting on the need to build consensus and to work on a difficult issue with respect and purpose, I would say that is what happened in this case. And some of you will be aware that the Uniting Church does have a policy on voluntary assisted dying, which I think is the only church, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the only sort of policy position that a church has put out on that issue that says people have a right to make that decision and they will be respected. So the only other quick thing I was going to say is we had a decision years ago around home care, the growth in home care that was quite controversial at the time within our board. People didn't really see it as a growth opportunity, but what turned the tide for us in terms of governance of this issue was an excellent business case being brought forward by the executive of the organisation, evidence-based, contextualised, all the financials, all the opportunities that it would present. And I think that's the role of the executive, to come to a board of governance with a clear picture of what they're actually asking us to consider. And then it makes life that much easier to make a decision, even if within the room there are different views.
Thanks, Raylene. That's a great sort of addition to that conversation, and such what is a challenging topic, I think, for lots of organisations. We have got a question from the audience, which I think is an interesting sort of additional thread here, and it's a question coming from a rural perspective, asking about if and where you provide services in a thin market location, how you manage a strategic planning focus to determine if you can hold a part of your business that's not returning a sound revenue stream, but is also kind of critical to that rural community. And so it's an interesting sort of question, again, that I guess goes back to, in part, to purpose, to vision, to your strategy as an organisation about how you want to run a portfolio business, and whether there is room in that for some parts of the business that are not delivering as much commercial return as others. So Darren, I wonder whether you might want to jump in on that one first, and then open to Raylene or Peter to add.
No problems. Thanks, Ben. It's a very real consideration. We've got a number of rural sites. They're MMM3, so they're not truly remote, but they're real challenges in terms of staffing, getting appropriate levels of RNs. You've got additional costs of providing services in those areas. And for us, we do go back to our strategic document. So you've got strategic plan, but also what I was mentioning before, the communities of interest. So, we're very committed to the southeast, we're committed to the Riverland, and we're committed to the Murraylands. So, and in fact, the Fleurieu Peninsula. So it'd take us a lot to move from those areas, because it's part of the mission, it's part of what we do as a Uniting Church group. So we focus our decision making on that in the first instance, but there's the reality to it. So they are making maybe not losses, but it's a difficult circumstance in each of those areas. And part of the reason for diversification was to actually find ways that we could navigate what is a pretty tricky time in aged care at the moment with the funding envelope. Quite simply, the ANAC funding, in our view, doesn't cover the amount of minutes, the 100 minutes, 100% of the minutes that's required. And so that's challenging. And we're looking at it as a holistic business to ensure that we can provide the services to the people that need it across all of our services. And hopefully, we're very encouraged by the Aged Care Task Force. We're encouraged by the work of IHACPA, but we need to see that adjustment to properly fund in those areas, and even the adjustment to the funding through ANAC has been a positive, but we need to see more of that, because we can't see those regional centres close. It'll be a disaster.
Thanks, Darren. Raylene, perhaps is there something you'd like to add to that response?
Well, I would just add, I first of all would agree that diversification and really, all of us, I think, who are still providing care into areas where it's not viable, let's be honest, are diversifying to try and, make our bottom line reasonable at the end of the day. And that's where our strategy around home care has really assisted us. We don't make a lot of money in home care, but we make a little bit of money in home care, whereas we all know most of us are losing money in the residential segment. So that's very important. The other thing I think that's very important there is that, I've been working one way or the other in this sector for 20 years or more, and the issue of rural and remote has been a constant problem that nobody ever seems to really address. So I think we have an obligation to all of us, not just the poor people who are trying to provide the care in these places, but all of us to raise the issues, through the task force and other avenues, because this has to be sorted out or there won't be any care in rural and remote areas.
Can I just say, look, I think that is right. Like the other panelists, I feel very positively about the work being undertaken by the Age Task Force. I do think there's likely to be a serious discussion about funding, including consumer contributions, and that's very, very important. But the reality is, I have a few regional communities, but not many. My focus with Opal is increasingly around broader metro areas, because in effect that's where I can assure the highest quality standards and better management. The real challenge that I'm finding in regional areas is, of course, workforce, and that's particularly with care minutes coming in, trying to find sufficient registered nurses, aged care workers more generally, is extraordinarily difficult. And I think at this stage, I would almost have to revert from being, the chair of Opal to wearing my previous public service hat and saying, when government is making these decisions, as it must make, about making residential aged care more financially sustainable, it does need to direct particular attention to where it is going to have to intervene. Because if it doesn't intervene in an even more significant way in regional and rural areas, it is difficult to think that care communities will exist. Because if you think about it, whether you're a for-profit organisation or a not-for-profit organisation, you still have to focus on financial sustainability. And right now, I think it's very difficult to make them financially sustainable and get the right people there. I think it's one where public policy has to think of ways in which it can intervene in order to support those very particular problems.
Thanks, Peter. And all it is, it's an issue across a number of adjacent industries and areas as well. Certainly, I do a lot of work in the disability space, challenges with thin markets, with service viability, workforce attraction in a range of those communities. So it is a broader issue as well. And to the extent that there are kind of market mechanisms to deliver services of this nature, then there will always be interventions required in aspects of that market to maintain viability and quality. So I think there's an interesting segue between that question in some senses and the next one I thought we might explore, which is about balancing those sort of bolder strategic decisions about where the organisation is heading and critical decisions that might be about direction, it might be about acquisitions, it might be about investment, it might be about focus, it might be about changes in delivery approach, any of those things. And as governing body members, there's a significant personal accountability that governing body members have around the organisation, and a significant responsibility for risk. And interestingly, I've come from a conversation this morning with the KPMG board, our chair and board and CEO here in Adelaide today, talking about how best to kind of carve out the right space in the board meetings to have the strategy conversation along with risk and compliance. And our industry as well is heavily regulated in different ways. And so I'm just interested in how if you are charting a path to some of those bolder strategic decisions, but you've also got quite a lot of procedural compliance and risk requirements, how you sort of square that circle in a sense, how you enable perhaps new ways of doing things, innovations within that kind of risk-constrained environment. So Peter, I might invite you to open up on this one.
Yeah, look, we are a very distinctive sector. This really is, in a sense, a public policy sector. What I mean by that is still the majority of funding for aged care, whether at home or in care communities, comes from government. And particularly after the Royal Commission, it is a highly regulated sector. Now, it's important, therefore, for board members to realise this additional layer of responsibility that sits on their shoulders. I have board members who sit on many companies who are deeply embedded in, corporate responsibility and what is required of non-executive directors. But of course, it's different again in the sector we work. I have to make sure that all of us are fully cognizant of, the aged care quality standards and understand, and particularly, of course, but not exclusively, I think it's standard 8, which goes to governance. Now, the problem is if you're not careful, you start to imagine that risk and compliance are one and the same. And of course, aged care communities have higher levels of compliance standards than most areas of the economy. And they're very important, both clinical governance standards and more broadly, consumer standards. Have residents got sufficiently control over the decisions that are made? But we have to remember that risk goes beyond those compliance. There is a danger, if we're not careful, that risk management becomes almost like compliance box ticking. And if we do that, we are not going to provide the sort of, quality homes that we want to for older Australians who deserve them. So we've got to think that compliance is important. The regulatory framework within which we operate is important. Understand the reasons for that regulation. Go behind the regulation, understand what motivates it, and then take that up in our strategic framework as part of a broader approach to risk and how to manage risk. See risk with eyes wide open. Don't let it deter you, but think of how you're going to manage it through.
Thanks, Peter. Darren, any addition to that one for you?
No, I think that's a really good point, particularly that business risk versus compliance. And I'm come from a finance background, and there was a time when the financials were front and foremost of the board agenda, and we've realised that it's important. It's a business aspect, but it needs to be balanced by things like strategy and risk, which would come at the front and of the discussion. So we always talk about, what are the strategic discussions we need to have? What is the risk component to that? What's the business of the meeting? And then we talk about the operations. And I think the challenges for boards now is to how do you demonstrate that you're meeting all the compliance requirements? How do you give the boards assurance that you're meeting those requirements, but don't bog down the meeting in looking at it? It's a very good point.
Thank you. Raylene, I'm happy for you to jump in on that one as well, but otherwise I'll turn to another audience question.
I would just really emphasise that goes to the heart of what is reported to the board, and the board, I think, has a responsibility to ensure that the executive are comfortable to come to the board with issues of risk, not just reporting on compliance. I think that's a really valuable sort of cultural thing to engender in your boardroom.
Thanks,
and I think it is important that however senior you are in the board or as the chair, you need to get on top of this. So, I actually carry around the little that the standards that the quality standards will on a phone app with me, just because it's a very good reminder that I have those accountabilities, responsibilities, answerabilities for those important standards. And you need to make sure that as you're doing your strategy framework and your risk management, financial management, that those standards are actually reflected in the way you conduct your board meetings and the way you construct your relationship between the boards and its committees.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got a question from the audience about technology, and we've been talking about bold decision making in the context of sort of challenges with financial viability. And one of the things that organisations need to sort of face into is the need to invest in technology, either to update core systems or to try and drive greater efficiency and productivity. Might be a whole range of reasons, but I guess one of those categories of bold decision is about kind of operations and back office, and what do we need to do to reform in some of those spaces as well in order to be fit for the future. And so the question from the audience is that tech adoption is an important but expensive endeavour. How do you go about deciding and funding it and getting board and staff buy-in? And Darren, I know you've been going through a program in this space. I wonder if you'd like to jump in on that question.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. We're just at the end of what's 5 to 7 year program of digital transformation at Resthaven, and it was a significant decision to make back then. And that was before my time, but and it did involve. It was a bold decision. We're talking $20+ million worth of effort to do that transformation. It's taken a significant amount of time, and I know that when I took on the role and looked at the strategic plan and saw that we were, 2/3 the way through this transformation, there was no way that I was going to add anything on top of that to get in the way of what is affecting the whole of the business. So we've put a community services system in across the board. We've replaced our ERP and payroll, HRM. The whole lot was changed, and the burden on staff and that process of change is significant. So I guess the way to look at it is, what's the risk if you don't? And we're now at a point where we can actually leverage from all the work that's been performed to take the organisation to the next level, to be able to better respond to our customers in a whole variety of different ways that would have been absolutely impossible with the old systems. And in fact, one of the things that was most frustrating was, we talk about data to information to insight. It was barely data. And so, yes, it's been investment, it's been a hard slog, and it's been a lot of money, but we're now in a better place to actually take advantage of that going forward.
Thanks, Darren. Raylene, I've seen you nodding there in the background. Got similar experience to add?
Yeah, similar experience. We're probably at a different stage in our sort of plan, but I always think about technology as an enabling function of the operational area, and I think as a sector, we spent a lot of years not sort of keeping up with what were the possibilities, and a lot of that I've always reflected was about from a government perspective, we were not funded to engage with technology. So, for example, the GP sector got a lot of money to upgrade their technology and get into the modern world 20 years ago and ongoing, whereas the aged care sector, unfortunately, was just told to do it. And so there was always a financial issue around how much you could invest. But again, I agree, not making that decision is a very risky thing to do in today's world. And I think you can see returns very quickly in staff retention, for example. We've got a workforce crisis. If your IT is not up to date, your staff will vote with their feet and go somewhere else where the burden on them is less in terms of technology. So I think it is a very important thing for people to grapple with, even if they haven't got a lot of money.
Thanks, Raylene. It really is a must-have in a sense. It's not if, it's sort of how and when. Peter, would you like to add to that one?
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations I suspect that all of us face in this sector when we have, the famous Sunday lunchtime barbecues with people outside the sector, and you talk about technology. They all want to tell you about some little robot they've seen that can go round on wheels and bring, our residents cups of tea. And it is really frustrating, I think, that perspective on technology. I think for most of us, certainly for me, a lot of the technology that I'm examining are platforms and software and apps that helps to do two things: to make the demanding work on the front line in our care communities easier for the people who are doing it. Make the reporting easier and so on, make their work easier, and also technology that can help to make the life of our residents better, whether it's, IT to communicate with their families, or ways in which they have more flexibility when they want to have their meals, for example. That's, I think, the technology that at the moment I'm investing in very significantly because of its, strategic purpose. Can I just say, though, because when we're talking about boldness, I think the boldest thing is often not to say we're going to undertake this innovation. The boldness is to say, and we will pull it if it doesn't seem to be delivering us the benefits that we had anticipated. And in Opal, I remember on one occasion we did this with, a new app which was meant to be able to help nurses, and in fact didn't work effectively. We weren't trialed it. So I think boldness is being willing to try new technology, but to be able to evaluate and monitor really carefully, and then be willing to take the bold decision to fail early if it doesn't seem to be delivering the results, or to adapt it. But don't just keep thinking, oh, we've taken this decision, that was our bold decision, we better keep on going, even though it's not giving us the benefits we originally anticipated.
Thanks, Peter. It's certainly, particularly once you've invested a lot of time and effort and money into something, it's challenging to then wind that back at that point. We've got only really a few minutes to go, and so I'm going to ask a combined question, and you can choose which part of it you'd like to answer. So we've probably got a minute or 90 seconds each on this one. Usually we try and end with a top tip. So whether there's sort of one piece of advice you'd have for the audience on as they're facing into this challenging environment and needing to support and make bold decisions, is there sort of one piece of advice you'd like to give? And then the optional extra here is from the audience, and it builds on a previous discussion, which is about how do you overcome resistance from stakeholders and communities to changes you might want to make in your service mix. So Raylene, I might come to you first on that, either a top tip or a piece of advice on engaging with resistant stakeholders.
Well, I'll just go to the tip, which is probably an obvious one, but I think maybe not taken seriously sometimes by governing bodies. I think our job at the end of the day, one of our big important jobs is to have the right CEO in place for your organisation. And I know that's an obvious one. We recruit, we employ, but it is essential. And I think that boards sometimes perhaps don't spend as much time thinking about what sort of person they're looking for to take their organisation forward and to manage it in the present. So my top tip is to spend a bit of time thinking about that as a board of governance.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I just pop in there only because I had it on my list? I absolutely agree. The most important decision that a board has, or some boards have, is to choose the right CEO. In Opal, we took the bold decision to select someone out of the sector whose background was in hospitality, in running hotels. That was bold, and we knew then what were the risks and how we had to manage the transition, but it's paid dividends. The other thing that I would add in this sector is for us to understand the purpose, the board to understand the purpose of regulation, not to see the commission is essentially as the bureaucratic burden that we all have to put up with, but understand actually we're on the same side in terms of providing quality aged care.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. And I think that that's a great observation, that there are a range of sort of actors in this space, and fundamentally they're all driving toward trying to provide high quality care for older Australians, and finding ways to work productively with policymakers and with regulators in that context to a good outcome is something around which hopefully we can all align. Darren, I'll come to you for your top tip.
I think it's about being prepared, and perhaps when those bold decisions come, that they're not so bold, so that you've done the work, you've got the frameworks in place such that you've regularly as a board reviewed where you want to be in the market, the regions, the size, and all of those things on a regular basis, but also do things like blue sky thinking, scenario planning, whether it be a leadership sprint or whatever, to really test the board on what they think about those matters, so that when you come together, that person A might have an alternate view, person B might be big for it. So you can come to the table and have those really robust conversations that will bring out the best outcome.
Thanks, Darren. That's a good observation. I think lots of conversations around innovation, people want to sort of talk about how are you innovative, and equally with how do you make bold decisions. In a sense, it's a process, and doing the work, making sure you've got the groundwork, making sure you've got the frameworks such that as you face into those, you've got ways of doing that in a repeatable method. Look, I've had a fabulous time talking to all three of you today. So thank you so much, Peter, Raylene, and Darren for being so generous in coming and sharing your thoughts and insights. I trust the audience have enjoyed the conversation as well. Directly following today's event, you will be sent an email with a link to provide your feedback. Feedback is a gift, and we would really love you to provide any feedback you have on the session from today. We've had lots of feedback from previous sessions, and that's really helped us refine and adjust the way in which we deliver these webinars and other parts of the program. Please, if you haven't already done so, there is a diagnostic tool available to you as part of the program. If you haven't done that, please go to the Governing for Reform website and complete the diagnostic. It's a really useful way of helping guide you through the materials that are available as part of the program, so that you can get the best benefit from it. As I mentioned earlier, there are a range of related learning activities available to you on that website. Some of those in particular are the Strategic Planning Toolkit. There's a podcast on strategy and innovation for change in aged care, and also a specific podcast around the role of governing body members in designing the future of aged care. I'm very much hoping you will be able to join us for the next webinar that we have, which is scheduled on the 13th of December. And the focus of that webinar will be on human centricity in aged care, the consumer, the employee, and the organisation. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your days.